We are not far from the point in time in which your deceased mother, heaven forbid your deceased child, can be re-embodied, that you could go back to their 6th birthday and do something new with them. We start to get to some of the really tricky ethics here.
A metaverse where people can feel as if they are actually interacting in the real world.
This 30-year-old term, this century-old idea, was actually starting to have the critical mass of technologies required to make it real.
We don't outlaw fire, we train firemen.
I'm optimistic that that can start to make a difference. Otherwise, we know the outcome, and that is that this education becomes not just more expensive, but as such more restrictive to those who can ever benefit from it.
Well, hello everyone, it's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another Infinite Loops. I cannot tell you how excited I am to have today's guest on. Today's guest is Matthew Ball, whose work I admire and think is inspirational, actually, for those of us who think that there are huge changes going on because of all of the various revolutions in technology. Matthew is the author of The Metaverse, Building the Spatial Internet, with a fully revised and updated version dropping on July 23rd of this year. Matthew, welcome.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I resonated so deeply with your work because we have a series that we're doing here at Infinite Loops called The Great Reshuffle. And while it didn't specifically focus on the metaverse is a huge part of what we see transforming the world and society and business models and literally everything. And your work on the metaverse was something like I'd been dreaming of a metaverse. I didn't call it that since I was like in my 20s. I keep journals and I was going through them because we're creating a sim gym. Which will definitely not be a level 5 digital twin, but it's really just for fun. But if you wouldn't mind, walk us through kind of what got you to say, oh my God, I think really this is going to be the next big thing that is literally going to transform everything.
Sure. So that's a great place to start. And there's really 3 different segmented answers to that. The first is to actually take a look at the taxonomy. There are some listeners or lost listeners who are rolling their eyes in their head. The metaverse, we've heard that for 3 years now. It's a buzzword, arguably one of the biggest, fastest, brightest burning buzzwords of some time. And in fact, it had appeared twice before. We saw it actually in the 90s when the term was coined. We saw that midway through the 2000s, primarily around Second Life, the advent of Google Keyhole, or now Google Earth. And then it came when Meta changed its name, and there are some who are exhausted who believe it hasn't come to fruition. What's important to recognize is that the term is in many ways, if not always, a distraction at this point. When you go to the late 80s, the early 90s, nearly all of the terms that we use today to describe any sort of simulacra environment comes from science fiction or small research labs of that era. And they reflect this rash of terminology, of coinage, as those at the vanguard of technology sought to find a way to describe what we might someday do, if not someday soon. And that reflected the advance of GUIs, or graphical user interfaces, the advance of the internet, and really the forefront of 3D simulation in video games really started to take off 3D in 92, 93, 94, 95. And so whether you're talking about artificial reality or virtual reality, both of which come from the late 80s in science fiction, or cyberspace, the Matrix earlier in the 80s, the metaverse for 92, or spatial computing, the term that Apple recently took on, comes from 92, 93. That was all based then on what people believed we were soon going to do. And now 30 years later, those terms are being repurposed, readopted, becoming to some extent part of corporate propaganda, terminology, branding, distinction from one another. And while there are small differences between what each of them mean, they primarily reflect the individual philosophies, perspectives, and products of those companies, which is to say, spatial computing, Apple's term, the metaverse, chosen by NVIDIA, Microsoft, Epic, Facebook differently on the margin, mostly talking about the same things, expressed differently through culture. So that's where I would start, to say we're looking at these 30-year-old terms that have started to diverge primarily through propagation through private entities, but all of them are efforts to vaguely describe something that was starting to manifest. The second point that I would make is those terms are not actually 30 years old. Well, they are as terms, but the ideas are a century old. They span early work in research labs, again, science fiction, many of the early investments of pioneers, including Marvin Minsky in AI, even Alan Turing, who first sought to apply artificial intelligence, computing, simulation into 3D, again, simulacra worlds. And we have been on this multi-decade and century-long advance to bring them to fruition. And so for that very same reason, we kind of see those theories, those ideologies, disconnect from the way we see the world today because the world has changed since those early ideas came to fruition. So those are the first 2 points that I would make. The third is really the acute and the interesting one, which is the why now, and in your question, why for me? Kind of like you, I've been obsessed with fictional worlds, virtual worlds of digital advancement for many decades, but it was really my personal experience in 2018 and 2019, spending a lot of time inside of Roblox, spending a lot of time learning the Unreal Engine, playing Fortnite, that I had come to this conclusion that this 30-year-old term, this century-old idea, was actually starting to have the critical mass of technologies required to make it real in the truest sense of the word. Now, of course, since then, it has become a very different scenario. We suffered from scope creep, from duration creep. When Mark Zuckerberg renamed his company, he was pretty clear saying he believed it was going to start emerging in 5 to 10 years. But of course, when the 7th largest company in the world, the youngest out of the top 25, changes their name, the expectation is not that it will slowly emerge 5 to 10 years out. We start to say, where is it now? Where's the product? Where's the revenue? Where's the return? The narrative very quickly shifted, and to some extent I played a part in that, to now. And that was never exactly how it was going to happen. The internet didn't happen that way. Mobile didn't happen that way. And, a few years later, we're seeing progress in some areas, not progress in other areas. But I would say that most of the underlying factors, number of virtual worlds produced each year, the number of people in them, the amount of time spent in their cultural import, more importantly, the broadening deployment of those technologies outside of leisure into healthcare and automotive construction continues to expand. In 2020, for example, the US performed its first ever live patient surgery using a mixed reality device. We're at more than 600 since, of which 400 were completed in last year. And so I'm really focused in the ways in which those were starting to coalesce a few years ago. And in the years to come, do we start to see that combinatorial compounding effect that will eventually start to realize what people have imagined for decades?
Yeah, I resonate with so many things that you've just said. Sometimes we are very guilty of becoming label thinkers. And when a label gets slapped on something, and then the various companies who are trying to grab that little piece of neural real estate will start their various propaganda, and they all get tossed into the big bucket label of metaverse. And so I definitely agree with you on the idea that there's a great quote. It is a mistake to try to understand new things too quickly. We often don't understand them and kill the baby in the cradle. So I absolutely agree that this is a directional movement, and it's not some quantum leap that suddenly we're going to have Ready Player One. But I also find it interesting to have those science fiction North Stars, because that's how, if we can't create something, if we can't imagine it, and we first must imagine it. And I was a huge fan of all of those early kind of cyberpunk science fiction, and then actual as well. And then I'm also really involved in AI through the investment arm of O'Shaughnessy Ventures. And you have a really interesting look at AI in the new version of your book. I wouldn't mind or I would love it if you'd be willing to walk through the impact that the AI getting to the level it's at right now, which was in many quarters unexpected, at least the speed with which it has gotten there, and how that plays into the overall concept of the metaverse.
So it's a great question. And I think there are a few different ways to unpack it. Often it is understood to be this arguably in contrast growth opportunity for tech. And I won't tell you that it's not diverting resources away from XR and VR and virtual worlds. That's often the case. I won't tell you that it isn't narratively changing Meta's future, even though Mark Zuckerberg will be quite clear that their priority remains around the metaverse. And he'll say something that I agree with, which is these are not divergent, they're not perpendicular, they're not a distraction, but instead the advancements in AI are essential to building a virtual parallel reality, or indeed a version of the real world itself that uses AI to help run the real world as we experience it. So let me bring that down. There's kind of three different categories if we want to simplify it into how AI is going to help us produce the metaverse or synthetic reality. There's multiple different specific implementations, of course, or myriad, but there's three that we can use simply. Number one is at the hardware level. Anyone who has used a Vision Pro or a HMD, that is a head-mounted display, will easily and quickly enumerate the challenges or their personal hesitations, right? It's too heavy, it gets too hot, it's not comfortable, the graphics look crummy, the battery life is frustrating, the resolution is poor, I'm nauseated. Most of those are indeed hardware problems, and we actually have a tremendous amount of science that proves that. For example, when you watch a television, most of us are watching a 1 to 2K display, and it's running at 24 frames per second. That's how we watch television. If you've watched on YouTube or you saw the Hobbit movies, it was at 60 frames per second. We found that eerie. Well, when you watch a video game or you play a video game, we typically aspire for 60 frames per second. And that's because you have this connection between brain and screen, input, output. And the delta, the gap between those frame rates, tends to drive disassociation. Now, that's when you're 10 feet from your television screen and using your thumbs as inputs. When you move that screen to an inch from your face, and that input is not your thumb, but actual movement of your head that's triggering the vestibular sense, right? Your inner ear. The requirement is really, really thin because all of a sudden your brain knows and feels change that isn't being represented in the world around you. And so we generally believe and see in labs that you need between 120 and as much as 240 frames per second in order to fully avoid that nausea, which, by the way, tends to affect women twice as frequently as men. And so just to diversify, not to say just grow penetration, we need greater advances to reach half of the population or just over half. Now, I also mentioned that a television is typically 1 to 2K. Well, if you've ever noticed, and Jim, you and I can do it right now, your computer monitor is probably 720 or 1K. And if you bring your nose all the way up to the screen, you start to see the pixels. You see those black borders. Mm-hmm. And that's because resolution is a question of how many pixels are there horizontally. It's not actually a question of how sharp does it look. And that's a reflection of how close you are to the screen, among some other variables, right? What's the size between each pixel, for example? That varies quite a bit. When you bring the screen all the way up to your face, you need a much, much higher resolution. Otherwise, it looks like you're looking through a screen door, quite truly. And so we believe, between 8,000 pixels and 16,000 pixels. So what does this mean? Well, when you're watching a video game on a television screen, you are looking at 60 frames per second running at, and they're rendering in 1K or 2K. If you want to up the resolution from 1K to 8K or 16K, that's 8 to 16 times as many pixels the computer has to generate. And then if you want to say, instead of generating them 60 times a second, we want to do 120 or 240 times a second, you're talking about a 4x additional increase. And so this is where we start to talk, and I'm simplifying a whole bunch of other things, right? The more pixels, the more work, the more heat, the more pixels, the more work, the more battery you're using, the more of all of these things, the heavier the device is. But just to simplify down to computation, really, really hard. And so when you're taking a look at HMDs, I use this quote where Mark Zuckerberg says it's the most difficult technological problem of our time because the number of different points of optimization are extraordinary. Then you say, you want this device to look at the world around you. You want it to preempt what you think. You don't want to be wearing controllers on these glasses if you're to take them outside, you're walking down the street. This is a long-winded way of saying, to start to solve the literal hardware problems that we face of nausea, of rendering, of size, significant advancements in AI are going to be required. And so we already actually start to see that now. When you take a look at your phone, and I promise it's a long-winded answer, but it's kind of important because it explains that answer of why people think these devices aren't getting better. You know, our iPhones have gotten much, much thinner over the years. And yet we still have this bump for our lens. And that's because we're pretty good at making transistors smaller or putting computer power into the smaller size or the same size of a computer chip. But the only way to have better images is to let more light in. And that's either from larger lenses or more time in the exposure. And so we face a very true physical reality there. And yet, even though your lens hasn't gotten bigger, sometimes we add 2 or 3 to your iPhone over the years, the photos have gotten much better. And the answer is AI. None of your photos are really real. There was this debate on Forbes as to whether or not they're going to use AI to upscale photos. And they use this picture of Sam Altman, right? They've got a blurry Sam Altman and then they've got a sharp Sam Altman. And they say the latter one we ran through an upscaler. And I wonder how many people realize that when they go to see anyone, right? I take a picture of you right now, Jim. The photo that I'm looking at used AI, a neural network on my Pixel or on your iPhone, to upscale that image. It's not just figuring out when you're smiling, when your eyes are closed. It's not just using its recognition of when humans look good. It's taking a look at everything in the image and taking a bunch of images around it to better understand context and then stitching that together. All of these technologies are now being used to actually produce experiences that are beyond the pure physics the device is capable of. And so that first area is we are using AI to start to exceed what's possible. There are some other areas where Meta will talk about, the use of neural interfaces. Mark very recently started talking about using new types of bands. It's called electromyography that basically work like Luke Skywalker's hand was after it was cut off. And it's reading electrical signals across your skeletal muscles to then pick up and interpret, not track what you're doing, but to know what your brain says you should be doing, and therefore generate it into real time. By substituting, and that's using not just AI, but personal training, you now can remove hardware in the device that today is more cameras, more space, more heat, more cost, more battery draw. And so that's this first area, as we start to talk about the use of AI to actually produce the devices that we think we want and dream of, but are actually either perhaps never possible or certainly not possible on a short time horizon. I'll pause there before we head to the second two.
The example of the camera in your phone is one that I use often with people who are interested in AI, but haven't really done a deep dive. And many times they express fears of AI. And one of the first things I say to them is, have you taken a photo with your smartphone today? And most of the people say, yeah. And I say, you just used AI today. And one of the things that amazed me was like the number of people who just did not comprehend that at all. The fact that we are already using AI procedures, AI models in a variety of things that are already very commonplace, like our smartphones. The thing about AI that fascinates me is the what you referenced it. One of my favorite physicists is David Deutsch, and one of his quotes is, "If it doesn't violate the laws of physics, it's true." And you've said something that I really find fascinating that involves AI. AI can change the laws of physics in a way that the real laws of physics can't. It can't be modified or changed. Talk a little bit about that as you go on to your second and third points.
Yeah, I mean, look, in some ways, actually, just the examples that I provided are some of the more primitive ones that we're using, right? In the interactive space, we often talk about latency, and latency is bound by the speed of light, right? The amount of time that it takes for my device to send you data and to get it back, or that to a remote data center, or least of all, a friend of mine in Japan, is bound by the speed of light. Not only is it bound by the speed of light, it is bound by the physical properties of the transmission medium that is sharing that light. And so we talk, for example, about fiber optic cables. I'll tell you the sad thing about fiber optic cable. The silica glass slows down the transmission speed by about a third, 40%. It doesn't slow down light, of course, but what it does is it has slight reflection. That means that light going through the silica glass is bending ever so slightly so that it's zigzagging, thereby elongating the distance between 2 points, resulting in a 40% elongation of the transmission time. That is not just a question of you and I, several states apart. It's not just about you and I talking to our colleagues in Asia. It's a literal reality of every query that we make to a remote data center. And it becomes super relevant when you come down to questions like, I'm wearing AR glasses and I've tilted my head just slightly, and now my device needs to reprocess the world around me and have that aligned to the human sense of information and speed and be relevant. And so you start to ask this literal question. A device on your face cannot store enough information in advance to understand everything it sees around you. And that device cannot relay all of that information to a remote data center that processes it indiscriminately and then relays it back to you fast enough. Can't do it, right? So you have two problems. Can't do it locally, can't really do it remotely. Well, the solution for AI there is to learn enough about you and to also be capable of understanding the context of what you're seeking to do, the context of the environment around you, to start to split the difference, right? To start pre-ingesting information that is relevant, to start purging out. And that's actually how humans work, right? We talk about low latent inhibition. Every time you look around, your brain is choosing which information to discard and which information to retain, and then which of that information should be consciously processed and not. The only way to start to get around that is by having AI start to split the difference, right? And frankly, to start to not just predict the information you're going to want, but to predict the behavior you're going to exhibit. There's this great quote, and actually I'll take it from Patrick's podcast. I think I used this point in the book, where he talks about the fact, or Kevin Systrom and Daniel Ek. I love these two examples. Both were interviewed by Patrick. And they both expressed, and I don't think it was highlighted in the podcast because they were years apart, they did the same hack to have their apps seem more advanced than they were and seem better than the competition was. One was the second you started editing your photo in Instagram, Instagram started uploading the photo. And so the result was, even though you were on a 3G network at the time, it seemed like Instagram instantly uploaded your photo, whereas all the competitors asked you to wait 5 to 10 seconds. And the answer was they didn't instantly did it. They started it before you asked. And then Spotify had a similar but different implementation where it takes about 200 milliseconds for someone to realize that they have pressed a button and the button isn't responding. And yet you don't store all of your songs locally. And so what Spotify was doing was the second you pressed play on a Spotify track, it showed the song start playing even though nothing was playing. but your brain said, look, the song's playing, and it's so brief a delay that you don't expect to hear anything anyway. And so those are these like atomic versions of where you're saying we need these sophisticated systems to not just stitch and pre-stitch and predict and diagnose and discard, but actually to say, here's what Jim's going to start to do. And let's assume what behavior Jim's going to exhibit once he engages in it. And then that's how you start to solve around that problem.
I recall reading about Netflix and the CEO saying that the greatest thing that they wanted to optimize for was exactly that. They all they cared about was, do I get connectivity from a basement on an older model cell phone, right? And because using exactly the same example that you gave, it's a bit more human engineering, right? Because both of the examples you just gave
Totally
are human engineering, and that's what he was trying to solve for. The illusion, if you will, that, oh, look, my God, I can't believe I can watch something on Netflix with just one bar. And I think that all of that also plays into the idea of external evolution within the human brain, for example. I'm sure you're familiar with the book, The Weirdest People in the World, in which they make the case where highly literate people literally have different brain structures than people who are illiterate. And what happens is the portion of the brain that had been devoted to visual acuity gets colonized by the ability to read. And it literally changes the shape of the brain, right? Do you anticipate that we're going to see vastly more of this type of interactive evolution as our models and tools get better?
the field of neuroscience, and certainly the interaction between digital exercises or digital training and the ways in which that's shaping the brand for good and for ill, is not an area that I can speak to, better than a field expert. And so I wouldn't want to speculate too much. What I will say is, the following. We do know that in a number of different fields that playing video games, traditional, or like what we would consider a fast twitch AAA video game like Call of Duty, is really good for precise muscle memory and capabilities, and is actually an effective form of training maintenance for everything from surgery to in the field combat for the armed forces. It keeps the brain actually highly trained in visual processing, in memory management and prioritization, and in quick, precise movements and responses. Now, at the same time, it's also very clear that what you would call passive interactivity, which is to say your brain is very locked into a certain form of engagement, but very disassociated from others, right? Your body's not moving, you're not circumstantially aware, you're not using parts of your brain, especially as a child, for construction. That has deleterious effects. I'll tell you, as a parent, we are very anti-screen time for quite some time. In fact, like even now, the 2 weeks that are most cherished to me each year are when I go completely remote in the cabin. We have 24K 28K dial-up internet. And that time, just me unplugging now, is extremely important to me, as it is every day, but especially for a general detox. And so I'm very mindful of that, especially for children as they're growing. I think to assume that there wouldn't be some long-term negative impact would be naive. But I'm also optimistic about the ways in which, separate from brain reprogramming and reorientation, it can be positive. And I thought the pandemic was like a really good version of that. One thing that's interesting is in the United States, we have two super reliable measures of educational progress. And that comes on two different dimensions. It's math and reading scores for ages 9 and 13. And I spent a while talking about this in the revised edition because, of course, the pandemic data has come out since the first edition came out. And so we have those four total scores, right? 13 math and reading, 9 math and reading. All four of them dropped after the pandemic. 3 of those drops were the first ever drops measured. And this is going back to the early 70s. And of the one, which I think was Boys Math 13, it was one of two drops, and it was 3x the largest ever reported drop. That is to say that we have pretty good evidence on multiple different factors, whether that's the Zoom fatigue score, Zoom exhaustion score, or education and general attention, that this is not a particularly good medium for learning, right? Even for socializing, this is not a great medium for you. I will never tell you that using these interactive tools is likely to supplant in-person school, but I will also say that that's not always an option, and it's certainly not a resource that is equally distributed globally, right? Our children have the great luxury of learning in one of the most resource countries on earth, which are with a real system of pedagogy and a strong educational pipeline for teachers, imperfect, of course, but most people don't. It's also very costly. It's also very resource intensive from the individual person. And we do have a lot of evidence that though among children, for example, screen time can be bad, we also have a lot of evidence that as a substitute for alternative forms of remote education, whether that's a print textbook or a digital quiz or Zoom school or an ebook, that there are profound leaps. And we see that in all measures. One of which is body language, another is memory recall, another version is through nonverbal forms of communication, brow movements, head nods, and others. And some reestablishment of actual intimacy, right? You can make eye contact with your peer, with the teacher. You can feel like you're present in a space. It's no mistake that when you take a look at Meta's version of the future with mixed reality and Apple's, they both very prominently deploy medicine in their videos, as well as both in school and out of school use of these technologies for education. And these happen to be some of the areas in which we see real results, at young ages in particular.
We're investors in the Synthesis School, which has now just gone to fully to AI tutoring. And the reason we made the shift was the data. The data was relatively unequivocal in terms of the efficacy of the AI tutor being able to train on the unique student, right? So in a way that is not impossible for humans, but much more difficult for humans. I mean, simple things. I'm sure you're familiar with neuro-linguistic programming and that some people are visual. And so communicating with them, you're going to say, can you see the big picture? But others aren't, right? Some people are auditory. And so when you say, can you see the big picture? They literally can't, but they can hear the ring of the bell. And so the AI, that's sort of like child's play for the AI to train on the individual student. And the results have been really pretty phenomenal. But I also agree wholeheartedly in the idea that the in-person interaction, whether or not you're having it augmented by technology or not, I agree with you. I don't think that's going away. I think, however, that we'll be able to improve instruction in a huge manner with all of these new technologies coming online. And the point you made about people who play games, absolutely not lost on me. There's the so-called Flynn effect, and much of that idea where we saw IQs going up over the last century came from these interactive type experiences where at least that was his conclusion. Now, they weren't the sole reason, but they were a reason. I wonder if one of the things that I notice is people axiomatically being opposed, right? Like we've seen it now with AI. We've seen it. What people don't quite understand unless they really do a deep dive is you have to have context around this. And if you go back and study all innovations, what do you find? You find that there is a not insignificant minority of people who just reflexively are opposed to it. Do you see that as just part of the cost of doing business as the metaverse emerges? And if you do, what could we do to ameliorate some of those concerns in people who are kind of having this knee-jerk reaction?
Yeah, so this is a funny one, and I can tell you, I did a pretty broad book tour when the book came out in 2022. And one of the things that was actually very interesting, and it probably reflects partly my naivete, is I didn't really tailor the examples to the audience to the extent in which I should have. And by that, I mean, like, when I went in the tech press, when I went to the conservative press, the liberal press, the more traditional publishing press, the examples I used were typically the examples that I thought were strongest or had the most data. And of course, you find out very quickly that's the wrong way to do it, right? There's a caustic response. It was partly a response to that. And I'll tell you, one way that I do this realistically is, and this is a good example of what the left side, I left identified and Canadian, as you know, really disliked, because they thought it was a depressing way to look at improvement in society through the avoidance of bad behaviors we already exhibit, whereas others take a look at it a little bit more as substitution. What I like to remind people is the current state of human society, right? People talk about Homo sapiens or Homo economicus. I like to actually recharacterize this. We're actually a TV species, especially in the West. The average person in the United States, and I know this sounds crazy, is actually only awake for about 14 and a half hours per day. Most of us are actually asleep for 7.5 hours. And that's predominantly skewed towards older and younger ages. And of course, the population pyramid skews that overall. But of that 14 and a half hours, of which the average person in the workforce is working 30, 35 hours, the average person does nothing more than they watch television. The average American watches 5.5 hours a day of video. When you get into some of the older age groups, seniors, the average senior watches 7.5 hours of television per day. 80% of that time is done alone. Nearly all of that time is done sedentary. And so I understand the perspective that a world in which we are wearing these devices, disassociating us from the physical world around you and from the people around you, and in fact, arguably, in some sense, society at large, is not seen as desirable. And I can understand the perspective that says whether that's 30 minutes a day or 2 hours a day, that's not a desirable outcome. And I'm a huge advocate for the outdoors. I used to be a forest firefighter. I love the outdoors. I've slept in tents for hundreds of days. And yet I do think that we need to recognize that most of what we do is by ourselves. It's a passive medium. And I think that the substitution of some of that time into a more lean forward, active, engaged, predominantly multi-participant medium, just when we're talking about VR or interactivity at large, is, I think, generally a good thing. I also think that when we take a look at that older demographic, which is skewing up, there are a few people who hope to retire and spend 7.5 hours a day watching television. That is a reflection of physical limitations of the body and ailments. It's of economic limitations. And frankly, in many instances, it's a limitation of people and things to do more with. And that substitution seems particularly positive. I also think that when we take a look at a number of different use cases, you can see much broader societal benefits. We talked about education earlier. Irrespective of the ways in which that can supplement the existing forms of in-person and remote education, I deeply believe that it can enrich the educational opportunities available to those who cannot today access what we in the West would consider a high-quality educational experience. Watching posted videos from MIT professors is not particularly effective. You talk about using AI agents to supplement classes. We now have versions of virtual field trips that exist that can be shepherded by those same AI. You can go tour Paleolithic Earth the labs of Niels Bohr, and others with a personalized AI agent who can bring you through that experience individually, you, Jim, and with others. Again, not going to say that's better than MIT, not going to say that's not better than a Montessori upbringing. But for the billions of people who can't access any of that ever through geography and income and the local school board, I believe that that's great. Even in the most physically intensive industries on Earth, these technologies, a mixture of digital twins and superior immersion technologies, are leading to remarkable advances. Often in the very segments of the population where many believe that mixed reality and or AI will either obviate job classes or the need for their product. I'll give you an example. Many of the earliest adopters of pure VR happen to be in the oil and gas and industrials part of the economy. I know for a fact that 9 of the 10 largest oil and gas refiners by BOED are deploying VR pretty extensively. Their primary implementation of those technologies are for offshore oil platforms and rigs. These are really, and I talk about this example in my book, these are really dangerous environments. I don't know if have you ever been on an oil rig?
No.
It's wild. I've been on a few, but the weirdest thing is, especially at night, they're so foreign. It's like being in the movie Alien, right? Like you're in Ripley. It's like, it's pure dark, it's industrial, and it's foreign. You're in the high seas, the sound is deafening. Nothing about the light is natural. The sounds you hear are unnatural. It's a disorienting environment. It also happens to be one of the highest risk professions of fatality and death in the United States. And in particular, if you're near the drill, it's really high. I think it's 35 to 50 per 100,000. And these devices are being used to improve training and onboarding, familiarization before you set foot on the platform. And that's actually important because that's actually an environment where it's pretty hard to acclimate before you set on foot. And this really potent example that I received or heard was that not only was it improving the onboarding time and reducing the workplace harm rate, but they concluded that by dry running this with individuals, they learned that the signage in this digital environment was misplaced. You know, in an emergency, because you can track people's eyes, in this simulated emergency, you start to see where did people look, and you find out like, well, actually, it turns out that in a lot of instances, people did not see an important alert that they needed to. And sometimes that's about placement, sometimes that's about color, sometimes that's about size, sometimes that's about the interaction of the environment. You know, you have some lights flashing and spinning that in many instances interact with a sign that is visible, but not necessarily in a sensory overload interaction environment. And so that's leading to upstream changes in design and workplace safety. And so usually when I'm going through, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm getting better at tailoring to the audience, I start to talk about the ways in which we actually have not really controversial exemplars of the lift that this can provide. And like all technologies, the implementation is tricky, right? We're going to do things wrong. I think in general, and AI is a great example of this, we can certainly talk about the net societal benefits and the ways in which individuals can retrain to take advantage of them without properly considering that there are swaths of the population that will never have the time to retrain, never practically get through it. They get cast aside because they are marginally rounded into other benefits. And in the case of teen depression and other social anxieties, there's often a 20-year time horizon until we properly understand the downsides of these accumulated technologies. But I do think that we see enough examples of where these benefits are starting to accrue. You know, the first surgeon who performed live patient surgery using a mixed reality headset said it was like using GPS to drive for the first time in the 90s. And I love that example because you don't think about that as a substitute. We don't use GPS instead of driving. We use GPS to complement driving. And on top of that, GPS is markedly better than it was in the 90s. And GPS has actually become a platform for Uber, for DoorDash, for Tinder, and much more. And so I think if we're starting to see those primitive benefits now, when this technology is still so lackluster, and I don't mean virtual reality, I mean simulation, digital twins, AI complements at large, I personally get inspired by what that can entail. And that's where I focus my time on, what will it be when?
And that is something that I am absolutely passionate about as well. The idea that, as you brought up, television is a passive activity. It is one way. It is not communal, unless, of course, you're watching with friends and interacting with them as you're watching the show. And for example, I would give a use case of AI. Wouldn't it be great if some of the elders in elder care could have conversations with loved ones, with an AI friend? And the minute I say an AI friend, you should see the looks on the people's faces. And I get one of two reactions from those who react very negatively. The first is, that's horrible. Their actual children or their actual grandchildren should go and see them. And, so they put up, well, this is the way it ought to be, right? Okay. I will stipulate, okay, right, you're right. That's the way it ought to be. But that is not the way it is. I have a 97-year-old mother-in-law who lives with us. Now, I have the privilege of having that happen, right? Because I can economically take care of that. There are billions of people who can't. And if you walk into a elder care facility, the reality of the situation is there are older people literally sitting doing nothing because they don't have enough TVs to go around. They don't have the radio, which I witnessed in one of these facilities. Like, they were literally fighting over who got to listen to the radio, and then say, and you think that this other option, which could be real relatively soon, why is that bad? At least they're interacting. At least they're reminiscing. At least they're being able to have a conversation. And I think that it's the element, as you bring up on the oil rig. We are frightened of very unusual or out of the ordinary environments where we haven't found ourselves in the past. Mm-hmm. I don't think that should cut off our thinking about what could be possible under certain scenarios, right? And to the idea of digital twins, I definitely believe that at some point in the next 10 or 15 years, maybe 20 at the most, I will have a digital twin, and that digital twin will have done my genome. They're going to be able to do all sorts of things that I certainly am not going to let them do to me, to my digital twin, to see, okay, is this particular medication efficacious for Jim's genome or not? And so I sometimes get frustrated with people who sort of forget that, as you say, people are watching 7.5 hours of TV. To me, that is an enormous waste of the person's time and mind. And it's not that I don't watch TV. I watch very little. But the idea that these technologies allow for interactivity, however limited now, does not mean that they aren't going to be amazing. And does this mean that I'm Panglossian about it? Of course not. There will be all sorts of new problems that these technologies will generate, and we will address them as they present themselves. And some we will address well, and some we will address poorly. I'm not trying to be utopian in my thinking. I just think that the ability to use these technologies to at least solve or in some way ameliorate situations, which I find very dire right now.
Uh-huh.
And you mentioned the educational system. You're absolutely right. There are billions of children who do not have the resources available to them. And so we did, through Stability AI, a project where we gave AI tablets to children in Malawi. And not only was the government pleased, they were skeptical at first, right? But not only were they pleased, they're like, can we get more of those tablets? Because literally these children, it was going from like nothing to something. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, look, I love this topic. I think about education quite a bit because I think it's so profoundly important, and at least in the United States, we have so long struggled to come up with a solution. And by that I mean, I think most people are surprised to understand that since the advent of the internet, there is not a single sector of the US economy that has shown greater cost increases. There's not only no evidence of productivity improvements, but while healthcare costs are up about 800% since 1982, 1983, when we typically give the birthday to the internet, it's just a chosen date. It's up 6, 7, 800%, depending on the classification. Education is up 14, 15, 1600%. And that is mostly because of cost disease, yes. But it is also a reflection of the fact that all of the technologies that we have implemented into the school have not actually led to the most fundamental measures of improvement, which is we don't teach faster than before, right? We haven't shaved a grade off of high school or college. We don't use fewer resources in people. In fact, the number of educators per student that we believe is optimal has gone up. And the cost of other resources in real estate and books has gone up as well. And so that's why we see this cost increase. And so the question becomes, how can we actually solve for that? And I'm a big believer that if we have better technology that is more immersive, we will start to remedy them. I am cognizant of the fact that people giving interviews, not unlike me, for 40 years have been saying exactly. They've been saying, well, what if you could have Hollywood Squares at home? What if you could have a digital quiz? What if all of the libraries of MIT were available for you to learn at home? And so I'm cognizant that the burden of proof here is very high, and I can't yet prove it by proof. But I do believe that many of the aspects that we have lost or been as yet unable to replicate with distance education are often the most important, right? That is a personal connection to a teacher, a professor, a TA, or some sort of facilitator. And it is the sense of people with you, with whom you learn. It is the combined effect of both of those constituents knowing you. And it is the fact that we know that the best way to learn is not to read, it's not to hear, it's not to do a quiz, it is to do. And that is one of the things that fundamentally with technologies we have not yet been able to do. Building a Rube Goldberg machine is much better than understanding the physics of how a Rube Goldberg machine works. A dissection is more powerful than looking at a circulatory system or organ system in a book. And we are starting to get to the point where you can not only do that, not ebooks, and not just do it like a 90s game, but do it immersively with your friends. And I'm optimistic that that can start to make a difference. Otherwise, we know the outcome, and that is that this education becomes not just more expensive, but as such more restrictive to those who can ever benefit from it, and that helps no one. Now, at the same point, I kind of love the point that you're talking about, which is a virtual friend, and this is where we start to get to some of the really tricky ethics here. And this is actually where we start to get into this intersection of where the advances in AI and the advances in simulation start to freak people out with good reason. I'm of the digital era. I have tens of thousands of emails that are online. I have millions of different messages that I've sent, spanning back from IRC to BlackBerry Messenger to WhatsApp and Signal, iMessage. One could do a pretty adequate job of training an LLM to behave like me, to write like me. You can certainly have someone, you could probably find enough audio of me to make someone sound like me. If you saw Mark Zuckerberg interviewed by Lex Friedman, a hyper-realistic avatar of Mark that looks and feels like them. Apple has launched as part of its spatial photos what you can use your iPhone to reproduce your home, your pet, your environments. we are not far from the point in time in which your deceased mother, heaven forbid, your deceased child, can be re-embodied, that you could go back to their 6th birthday and do something new with them. And it would be really real. Like some get creeped out about the idea of her, right? The non-existent person. Honestly, we are not that far from having a facsimile, not a great one, of a real person that you can experience not just in real world environments, but in real world things that happened, combed together from the hundreds of thousands of images you and your family have taken throughout your life together. The ethics around that are going to become challenging. The emotional consequences of those are going to be pretty mixed. And I think it's easy to say that the net will be negative. The ability for any legal structure to intervene is negligible, right? It's private property. And I do think that's where we start to get into these, really tricky questions. And even around the world, not to take this too untowards, is we're already encountering this with deepfakes, is the policy around negative uses of that, around pornography, of revenge porn, frankly, of child pornography that we're starting to entertain, of violence, right? Like, you start to ask this question of what's an appropriate simulation? And you start to get into worlds in which we know what, I'm not going to get into examples, but like the bad things that malcontents or the mentally unwell conceive of, and that start to become a realistic opportunity or something that can perpetuate those poor thoughts. Those are going to be real challenges, not unlike the last 40 years of the internet have produced similar versions of those, and in some instances, less frightening.
Yeah. And I think that it is far more subtle than a dichotomy, a yes, no, we can solve this, we can't solve it. Listen, it's going to be highly nuanced, and we are going to have a brand new set of challenges and things that we have to fix, if you will. You were a fireman, right? We don't outlaw fire. We train firemen. We have fire drills. We have fire extinguishers. We have all of those things because the power that good old Prometheus brought to us is so overwhelmingly positive in the general sense that the external negative, the externalities of that have to be dealt with. And I definitely think that we will face similar challenges on this front, on the front of the metaverse, on the front of AI. However, I believe that we will be able to, as these new challenges present themselves to us, we will be able to solve the majority of them. I'm not certain at all that we will. In fact, I'm fairly certain that we will not solve all of them. But as they evolve, we will get, I hope, better and better at coming up with solutions. And one of the things that animates me is the discovery potential of just sticking with education of a metaverse where people can feel as if they are actually interacting in the real world. In my old writing, I called it base state reality. And that we were going to be moving further and further away from base state reality, mostly for fun, but also for educational purposes and a variety of other things. You mentioned that the data on me and on you is sufficient that we can create a reasonable facsimile thereof. That's exactly the experiment we're doing with what we call SimGym. I have written 4 books. I kept journals since I was 18. I've been interviewed a ton, and we're just dumping it all into the large language model. And it's kind of fun to see how close or how distant that SimGym is going to be. And yet, if you think of an educational use case, wouldn't it be great to put all of the writings of fill in your favorite philosopher into a large language model and then actually have kind of a Socratic dialogue with Wittgenstein or Kant or whomever you want to. Boy, I'd love to talk to Richard Feynman, and he wrote a lot. How cool would it be to be able to dump all of that in there? And then I just have an app where I can ask him a series of questions. So I definitely think that, the precautionary principle, it is wise to have a precautionary principle, I believe. I believe it is very unwise to push the precautionary principle to a level where you want to just be so careful that no real progress happens. That leads, in my opinion, to stasis, and stasis is death. And so I think that we need to be very mindful of all of these. That's why I love your work. You don't sugarcoat things, and you are very careful to look at both the advantages and the disadvantages that we might see. But in silico, digital twins of me doing all the testing there, I honestly believe that when it gets to the level where we can really make incredible discoveries, we'll look back and think, my God, we used to test this stuff on animals, or we used to actually have human trials well before we ever should have. And so I always try to bring in the idea that, yes, of course, there's lots of bumps in the road, and it's a slow path and a circuitous one. But I think directionally, the area that we're going to is phenomenal. And what I mean, like every day, I joke with my wife, like, how lucky are we that we are alive at this time? And I look at my grandchildren, and of course I worry, and of course I have all of those normal human emotions that a grandfather would have. But for the most part, I'm just excited for them. You often talk about over-indexing on the young. That is something that I believe in passionately. Most of the people who work as my teammates and colleagues at O'Shaughnessy Ventures are in their 20s or early 30s. And I just think it's phenomenal, because they, being much more the digital native than me, although I was the kind of uber geek who was I have one of the earliest membership numbers on CompuServe, if you recall that online network. Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to change gears and look at what this might do to media, because you also talk a lot about that. You've talked about there being kind of the waves of competition in media. If you look at O'Shaughnessy Ventures and our verticals, you'll see that it's very media heavy, with infinite films, infinite books, infinite media that covers podcasts and things like that. And I love the way you outline it with, first it was access-based, then content-based, and then platform-based is going to probably be where the real fights happen, because with the information overload, I personally believe, and people get after me for saying this without defining it very clearly, but I believe that good taste is really underpriced right now. And good taste that leads to good curation leads to great platforms. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts about the evolution in the space, the media space.
Yeah, so I'll give a quick summary of this thesis, and I published it at great length at what I call the streaming book, which really isn't about streaming video. It's about how streaming video and streaming and digital subscriptions at large encapsulate what we've observed over the past decade. And you can find it at thestreamingbook.com. And it basically says that we see 3 different stages of competition amongst any new modality or technology. And that is, the first is access-based competition. In short, a new technology emerges which fundamentally and profoundly improves the ways in which consumers access media. It's so profound in advance that it starts taking share from the old modality, and there's relatively little intra-modality competition. This is Netflix and Hulu and Prime Video early on. It is ABC, NBC, CBS taking share from plays. Then it is the early cable networks taking share away from broadcast. They are cannibalizing, but out of the old thing, because the new thing is so demonstrably better. Better in delivery and quality and packaging and business model. And we saw that, of course, with Netflix and streaming at large to cable. But eventually those advances commodify. It's not that they're truly commodified, just as Netflix is still technologically superior to the video services that we have from all of its competitors, but the things that were previously really darn hard, building a streaming app, publishing it to every possible endpoint, even hiring the people who had experience doing those things, they go from being scarce and unproven to relatively straightforward. In digital, you now have dozens and dozens of middleware providers that will allow you to bolt together a Netflix-like stack in 2015 for zero, effectively. And it used to be really hard to get streaming television on a TV. Now you've got thousands of devices that will do it for you. There's a $200 Walmart device. When that commodification happens, the nature of competition naturally returns to the point of access, and that's content, what I call content competition. We saw that in the streaming wars in 2019. Every single company that could have a streaming service comes out with a streaming service. We see a surge of content investment, surge of product. We see rigorous competition among players, not before, but now, right? Because all of them are trying to get the scarce customer in the new modality, having mostly harvested the old one. And so in that environment, the primary beneficiaries are talent and certainly consumers who have more options and lower prices than ever before, but it's pretty hard to make a dollar because naturally content is only getting easier to make and the distribution advantage has gone away. But eventually you have the inevitable outcome of too much content, too easy distribution technically, and consumers that have so much choice that margins get whittled away to nearly nothing. And that's certainly what we've seen in streaming. Then you hit this third stage, again, which is shown throughout time, which is what I call platform. And the basis of competition that was previously access, then it was content, original content in streaming, becomes about the economic advantage, your moat. And that is the ability to extract more from your subscriber, primarily through attaching other things around it that they can do. If you take a look at the heyday of cable, that was bundling all your channels together. NBC bought USA, and USA took all of its 25 channels and they turned around to Comcast or to AT&T and Verizon and DirecTV, and they said, take all of them. And a video distributor like Comcast goes to you, Jim, and they say, you want TV? Well, you're going to have to take home phone. And then you're going to have to take internet. And then you're going to have to take smartphone. That's where your competitive advantage becomes. And so we see this playing out at large. Netflix goes into games. They go into interactive experiences. Amazon, of course, was a prototype for this. We see this with Apple, with their many different services, with their Apple One subscription, with the integration now into the Vision Pro and the interaction between their many services. Your question about taste is kind of parallel or perpendicular intersecting. And that is to say that nowhere here does it ever crystallize that taste is really the key differentiator here. But what we do know is that it is a form of remarkable operating leverage. And that's because taste doesn't cost more per se, just as spending more on something doesn't make it better. But the returns from taste equate to efficiency of content production for the same eyeballs, the same reach. It leads to greater catalog value, which means that an asset that you hope to capitalize, a podcast episode, a movie, a series of television, actually has enduring value over time, whereas others operate like OpEx. They're watched once, they're chewed, they're forgotten, and the recommendation algorithm naturally says never surface this again because there's too much other stuff. Jim's never going to watch it. And it leads to nonlinear pricing power. In the same way that Disney has great pricing power despite producing relatively little, because if you're a parent, you have no choice but to have Disney Plus. And so Disney Plus, if you can believe it, in 4 years doubled their average price. Why? Because the pricing power is remarkable. HBO is perhaps the best example. I'm often asked this question. Now, let's not forget, HBO does have a finite ceiling. There are not as many Americans as HBO, as Discovery, as AT&T before that, Time Warner before that, hoped would be interested in HBO. But it is also true that 15 years after Netflix, Amazon, 8 years after Apple started doing original programming, very few people in the industry or viewers would say that anyone has gotten anywhere near HBO's ability to produce content as good, as reliably, and in the volumes that it does. And taste is a great way to produce it, but it is what I think about as process, and it is about team. It is one of the companies that has the fewest programs assigned to a development executive in the industry, which means you, Jim, are assigned to fewer than your peer at another streaming service. They typically have you stick with it through the life of the show. There's relatively low turnover historically. And so you have this great example of you're an expert in overseeing under the HBO style. You've seen things from cradle to grave. You've done it hand in hand with several other colleagues. And you've done that under a model that has operated for 30 to 40 years under that scheme. That is to say, they don't talk about the HBO way, but there is an HBO taste. There is an HBO process. There is an HBO lingua franca. There is an HBO collegial trust cadence ability to work together that extends to talent relationships and extends to brands, but it mostly extends to how they develop. And it's the same reason why when you pluck a great development executive out of HBO and put them into Amazon or Apple or Netflix or Showtime, they're still a great development executive, but it's missing so much of the infrastructure. I can be as great an interviewer as you. I can get the same guests, but the entire system, including what I need to survive on the next episode in contrast to your next episode, it's all different. And that produces a real intangible and shockingly durable advantage. And I will tell you the great flip side of this, and it's why I've long been a Netflix bull, and I always thought that their international was underappreciated, is any American knows what HBO is and what it stands for, even if they can't clearly describe it. And those advantages have been hard earned over quite a bit of time. In most parts of the world, on the brand, on the library side, on the production and the talent deals, that's Netflix. They have built that abroad. And that started early in the 2010s. It's now 15 years in. That's a real durable thing. The weird thing about being an American watching Netflix, I think this is old hat now, but we kind of experienced the worst version of it. We experienced the worst version of it, and it's the most expensive version of it, and it has the greatest competition. And so that skews our perception of it. But second you step outside of the country, they've really got a different advantage here. But the HBO stuff is remarkable. And look, it's the same reason why, this is a longer example, but, to talk about taste and how complex it is. You remember when Macklemore came out in 2013, the artist?
Yep.
First artist, I think that was 2013. He's the first artist since Lisa Loeb in 1994 to have a hit #1 song on the side. A few weeks later, he does it again and has another #1. And then a few weeks later, he has a #4. And everyone in the industry was like, that's it. It's open. We're going to have no more signed artists. And then a little bit later, you get Chance the Rapper, not #1, but like pretty successful unsigned. But then what happens? It's been 11 years. There hasn't been another like that. Taylor Swift changed labels. She got a much better deal, doubtlessly. Drake released an album to get out of his deal, but he re-signed with Universal. Beyonce re-signs. But everyone still says this system, which has not seen its margins go down, by the way, in aggregate, has actually proven the value that many technologists believed didn't exist. They thought that they were just taxes, burdens on the system. Yeah, there was value in A&R. There was value in marketing. There was value in distribution. There was intangibles. But it wasn't actually responsible for making the artist a hit. And I'm not going to say they're more responsible than the artists themselves. Obviously, there's some instances in which that is true. But that talent development system of matching sounds with producers, with writers, with systems, with timing, has actually proven itself that that taste exists. And it's why we haven't seen true direct-to-consumer artists en masse, and why we're probably going to approach the same gap between Lisa Loeb and Macklemore, between Macklemore and the next artist to do so, even though the reach of all social and D2C platforms has just grown more and more. Taste is a really real, really valuable thing. It's just hard to put on the books.
Yeah. And the intangibles are, including taste, more and more accounting for the market cap size if you're a public company. My firm that I sold, O'Shaughnessy Asset Management, was a quantitative investment firm. And we were doing studies looking at the value of intangibles. And it's just literally, it's not quite exponential, but it's close.
Yeah.
And what you're seeing is exactly what you just described. Those moats that are, some would say are invisible, but are obviously there. And I use the term taste and the ability for curation. Your extension of that and elaboration on that is exactly right. Those systems are amazingly anti-fragile because they actually do work, right? And your example of Macklemore is really great because every time someone like him, and it's very seldom, right, when they come on the scenes, everyone's like, okay, everything's going to be direct to consumer, and that's the way it's going to go. I'm betting the other way. I am thinking, the vast majority of authors, for example, they benefit from a publisher like the one we're creating with Infinite Books because of everything you just mentioned. Are we ever going to get the person who's the massive author who loves to do everything direct to consumer? No, but we don't want them, right? That channel can be exploited very, very well. But it's much more, in my opinion, and of course, I've been wrong many, many times in the past, so I could be wrong here, but I think that is a unique channel that can really, the direct to consumer, that can only be exploited by very, very few. And it's not just artists, it's in a whole variety of things from books to podcasts to movies and whatnot. Well, I'm getting the hook on my phone here from my producer, and I haven't even touched half of what I wanted to chat with you about. This has been absolutely phenomenal. Before they really bring the hook and take me away, what have you seen recently that is that made you go, oh my God, oh wow, okay, this is going to be huge? And it can be in streaming, it can be in the metaverse, in any of the things in which you are a domain expert.
This is either going to sound evasive or boring. The one that comes to mind I can't share right now, but I'll offer, a somewhat side story. And it kind of gets to the earlier question on hardware and AI. One of the things I find really neat about the challenges that we've encountered with VR is it kind of gets to your question about mixed reality, augmented reality. It gets to that challenge of what we've discovered about humans. When you go to 2014, 2015, the consensus among all of big tech was that AR glasses, lightweight simulation glasses, were going to be solved within the decade and probably sooner. And they haven't been because the challenges technically are harder. Hasn't been solved because we've found that the human requirements are higher, right? I mentioned earlier that we're talking about 8 to 16K resolution with 100 to 240 FPS. We didn't actually think that was going to be it. And so all of a sudden you found out that the specifications were 4x higher than we anticipated, and 4x higher is not 4x harder, it's 200 times harder. But one of the things that we've encountered is called Vergence-Accommodation conflict. And I love this example. I think it's the coolest. Vergence-Accommodation conflict relates to how our eyes work. And this is where we're engineering technology to solve for the ways in which our bodies have evolved for thousands of years. We have binocular vision. When you are looking 5 feet in front of you, your eyes point in more strongly than when you look 200 meters behind. They diverge instead of converge, or rather, their relative convergence reduces. They move out. And when your vergence changes, your eyes broadly accommodate in precision and the retina changes a little bit. All of these things happen naturally when your sense of focus changes from 6 feet to 200 feet. Now, the problem that happens when you're in a VR environment or mixed reality, is everything's an inch and a half away from your eyes. And therefore, something that's 6 feet back and something that's 200 feet back is actually in equal focus. But your eyes are changing their vergence, and then your brain is changing the accommodation that comes from that in blurring and focusing. And then it realizes very quickly that that accommodation conflicts with the precision of the information that you're getting. And so one of the reasons why we actually get nausea and fatigue is because your brain is having to reconcile something that for thousands of years and your entire life has always worked essentially seamlessly. Now, you might say, well, what happens when you're playing a video game? Well, when you're playing a video game, the screen is 8 to 10 feet away, and therefore your brain is picking up local cues on depth from the real world. And if you're 8 to 10 feet away, and then the thing on the screen is 8 feet away, and then the thing behind it is 200 feet away, the percentage difference in the relative shift from the 6 and 200 is much, much more reduced. So even when you have that accommodation conflict, it adjusts just a little bit on a percentage term, whereas when it's right in front of your face, it's like a 90% difference in the relative accommodation. So then you start to answer this question, well, how do you solve for that? And there are a whole bunch of different solutions that are coming into work. And I've seen them in a bunch of private labs. The problem is these devices are already hard, they're heavy, they're costly, they use a lot of battery. Well, we have all of these solutions. Meta has released some of these publicly. One is they actually put a motor in these devices, and the screen moves back upwards of an inch as your own eye is changing. And what that's doing is A, providing a little bit of relief, but B, it's actually giving your brain a little bit of the feedback that what it thought was happening was happening. Another thing that's being done is, can the software using AI that is understanding where your eye is likely looking and using software to then dimensionalize the environment and selectively blur it to give your eye the feedback that it thinks it should see, but otherwise doesn't see because the entire screen is in focus. So now you're looking at a tree 60 feet behind. The tree is now in focus, but everything around it is out of focus proportional to how it would be in the real world. And then you get into some weirder stuff, which is to say, well, one of the reasons why you need glasses to wear the Vision Pro, you need prescription lenses to wear the Vision Pro if you require corrective lenses. And so you have to spend an extra $199 to get custom lenses for the Vision Pro. And then everyone in your household needs their own custom lenses that you need to swap out. That's burdensome because it's an extra $199. It's burdensome because it means more infrastructure needs to go into the device to be able to swap out the lenses. And it's burdensome because it makes the device thicker, not just costlier to accommodate that. The reason why you can't wear glasses in the Vision Pro, but you can in the Meta Quest, is because Apple puts the eye tracking cameras behind the lens. And by putting the eye tracking cameras behind the lens, they can see your eye and your pupil directly and therefore more accurately. But if you wore glasses, you would have two lenses in between your eye and the camera, and that would result in extra artifacts and extra reflections that would cause conflict. Meta says, as a result, let's put the cameras up and indirectly look at your eyes at the cost of accuracy. And Apple says, let's put it in front at the benefit of accuracy, but at the cost of new lenses. Where I'm going with this is there are a lot of advances that say, if your eyes see wrong, you have double vision, you have 25/20, you have hyperopia, myopia, astigmatism, why doesn't software correct for that, right? You can just negatively index for that same visual impairment so that you actually see the wrong image distorted with the exact physical properties proportional to the image you're looking at, right? 100 feet is going to have less distortion than 200 feet. And so that's AI that has to solve it. And it's actually the much smarter version of saying, let's do a motor. But of course, now we get back to the earlier problem, Jim. You're saying like, okay, that makes sense. But hot darn, you have to simulate the entire world or understand the physical world. And then, by the way, you have to render it 240 times per second precisely. And that's just darn hard. But again, it gets back to the way that we started, which is what's the intersection between these AI advances and this kind of device type? And the answer is, it may be that we can never do it the hard way, just with more computing processors, smaller hardware, bigger battery. And the answer is actually we just need smarter AI that understands the limitations of Jim and then distorts the world to do it, just like glasses.
So cool. I one of the other shorthands that I use often is that we are moving rapidly from mass production to mass customization. And if you understand the implications of that, as you've just eloquently outlined with that story, it can help you in your, if you are an entrepreneur, it's going to certainly help you decide how you're going to build things and which path you're going to pursue. And the brute strength path, I think, is now the one that is the lesser of the two roads. Matthew, I am just delighted that you took all this time with me. I can't wait. Well, I have seen the new book, but we are holding it very closely. And it comes out for all of our listeners and viewers July 23rd. Is that correct? And that will be available. That will be available everywhere. Well, our last question on the show is a fun one from our perspective, and that is we're going to make you the emperor of the world. You can't kill anyone. You can't put anyone in a re-education camp. But what you can do, we're going to hand you a magical microphone. And you can say two things into that microphone that is going to incept all 8 billion people on the planet. Whenever their next morning is, they're going to wake up and they're going to think the two things that you've said, that they are their own ideas. And they're going to say, I've just had two of the most brilliant ideas. And unlike all the other times, I'm going to actually act on both of these ideas right now. What are you going to incept into the world's population?
This is probably not the exact way in which you're asking the question, but it would be to spend the morning fresh, reassessing party and religious affiliation. Which one actually fits their instinctive, moral, and familial values, and why? Not fully, of course. That's not to say that anyone has the right or wrong religious affiliation or political leanings. But I do think that there's enough evidence to show that once you know the party position, your ability to even strictly do the mental math around correlation is forever tainted. And I mean that in the strictest way possible. That you cannot do basic math when your unconscious brain recognizes that answering the question correctly conflicts with your priors. We often do the math wrong. And so I think starting afresh is, our fantastic question where I'd begin.
I love it. And maybe that's why Orwell insisted that 2 + 2 = 5, right? Thank you so much for being with us. Where can I know you have a website, you have multiple locations where people can find you, but if you want to, we'll have them all in the show notes. Any particular place you'd point newcomers to first?
You can find me online, my essays at matthewball.co. They're as lengthy and long-winded as I have been on this interview. I note you say we ran through half the questions. I interpret that to mean I took twice the time to answer each one. I'm at Ball Matthew on Twitter, and ballmetaversebook.com will detail everything that's in this new edition. 70% of it is new. It's fun to discuss why it's new. That'll be for a later time. And you can see the testimonials, award sales, and everything.
Terrific. Well, this has been fantastic. I wish you all the best, and hope there's an episode 2, because I find this absolutely fascinating, and you as well.
I hope there's an episode 2 as well. I certainly hope there's not another book update coming, but we'll see what the world has in store. Thanks, Jim.
All right. Thank you, Matthew. Bye-bye.